everyone. You are listening into What's Going On, a podcast where we have important, relevant, and sometimes difficult conversations to inspire you to start your own. In today's episode, we're talking about holidays and Christocentricity. As we learn from our guest speaker today, I'd like for us to acknowledge the destruction and eradication colonialism has inflicted upon Indigenous folks and their culture. What's Going On is by Suffolk University's Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion in Boston, Massachusetts. Hence, we would like to honor the Mashpee Wapanoa, Akina Wapanoa, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts tribal nations whom this land originally belonged. It is imperative to acknowledge the Massachusetts tribe, who historically lived in areas that make up present-day Greater Boston. We honor the diverse tribes, people, and respect their connection to this land. As we discuss today's topic, let us remember to advocate alongside the local Indigenous community for their rights. To know more about the land you are on and ways you can support the Indigenous community, please visit www.native-land.ca, and for those of us in Massachusetts, maindigenousagenda.org. All of these resources and also the resources that we will be mentioning throughout this episode will be in the description box, both on anchor.fm as a podcast episode and also on YouTube. With that, I would like to welcome my guest for today, the Reverend Amy Fisher. Amy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. I am so pleased to be here with you and to have this conversation. I am the Reverend Amy L. Fisher, and I am the Suffolk University chaplain. Suffolk University is located in Boston, Massachusetts. I am also the director of the Suffolk University Interfaith Center and a senior lecturer in religious studies at Suffolk University. So I'm just very pleased to be invited and look forward to our conversation.
For sure. Thank you for taking the time. So today is, or at the time of recording, it's December 1st, right? And it's the start of December. And as we all know, December is well known not just for the snow, but also for Christmas. And so talking about Christmas, we know that there are a lot of holidays around the month of December too. You know, on your Interfaith website, you have indicated the other holidays that we have around this time of the year. And so would you want to, tell us some of the other holidays that are celebrated around this time?
Well, thank you for that question, because I think so many times we get focused on the holiday that we can relate to. I happen to be a United Methodist Christian, but I am a progressive and liberal Christian who has studied both world religions and particularly first century Greek and Roman religions. So I would just like to let people know that besides this celebration by some Christians of Christmas on December 25th, there is also Yule. Yule is the winter solstice that is celebrated usually right around December 21st, but only in the Northern Hemisphere. That's why I liked your introduction and land acknowledgement, because sometimes even neo-paganism and Wiccanism can be hemispheric centric. So we always say, well, if it's Yule, it's only Yule in the Northern Hemisphere. It's Litha in the Southern Hemisphere. So you referred to the Suffolk University Interfaith Center list of holy days in December, and we certainly make the distinction between Northern and Southern Hemispheres. But I don't want to talk too much, but I'll just run down. There's the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, there's Kwanzaa, there's the death of Zoroaster, there's Advent, there's St. Nicholas Day, there's Bodhi Day, the day that Buddhists celebrate, some Buddhists celebrate when Gautama took his place under the Bodhi tree, suggesting that Gautama was using he, him pronouns, Immaculate Conception, and Hanukkah. Yeah, there's just so many holy days. I don't think we should limit ourselves to one, do you?
I think the same, we shouldn't limit ourselves to one. And so that begs the next question that I have. Why is Christmas so well known, not just in the States, but across the world? Like I come from Singapore
Mhm.
and we celebrate Christmas whether we're Christians or not. And so what what do you think led to that phenomenon of mostly Christian related holidays being celebrated and honored across the world and not the others?
Well, first, let me back up 1 second because, as I said, only some Christians celebrate Christmas on December 25th. Many of the Orthodox Christians, such as the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, the Armenian Orthodox, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the original Christmas was in January. So, what happened when the Roman Empire consolidated power and the Holy Roman Catholic Church became the dominant European colonizer, if you will, a different holy day was taken away from December 25th. Let me start that sentence over. So December 25th was actually the birthday of a deity known as Mithra, Mithra. And the Roman Empire celebrated that holy day widely. And when the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire became the dominant colonizer, the birthday for them, for Jesus, was switched to December 25th. But notice how close that is to Yule, December 21. So it's actually a celebration of the returning of the light for the deity Mithra. I'm getting too complicated, but the reason I think that, to your point about Singapore, is that this is such widely celebrated, if you will, on December 25th. I think it's due to the colonial powers of the Europeans. As they spread everywhere, they took this holiday that they co-opted from someone else's birthday. And then I think a lot of the 1960s, which happens to be the decade in which I was born, you begin to get this commercialization of Christmas. And you know more than I do about, marketing and how things work with trying to get people to buy products. But now I think that December 25th is a marketing opportunity not to be missed for retail sales in any country. What do you think about that?
For sure, like Black Friday, Cyber Monday, that's when people try to buy gifts and it becomes almost not as like a celebration for people who cannot afford it. It becomes like an obligation, a stressful
Mhm.
time for them to have to buy it. And like you mentioned, not all Christians celebrate Christmas. And yet there are people who are not Christians like myself. Um, we find ourselves celebrating Christmas, and it's worth thinking about, like you mentioned, the colonial history of Christmas and how it did not just eradicate indigenous cultures to different countries in different countries, but also within the religion itself, like the religious community, I mean.
Mhm.
And so, talking about colonization, commercialization, and co-opting, you mentioned about pronouns earlier.
Mhm.
And I know in our conversations, we talk about, for example, like Buddha, we talk about even Jesus.
Mhm.
We use he him pronouns, and you
Mhm.
were like, well, and for Jesus, they are actually gender neutral. So would you want to talk more about that
Well,
aspect?
yeah, let me refer back to what I said about Bodhi Day, which December the 8th, big holy day throughout the world, but we don't hear about as much in the United States, Bodhi Day, and it's not honored or celebrated by all Buddhists, but some Buddhists would suggest that December the 8th is the time when Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, took, quote, his place under the Bodhi tree and vowed to remain there until Gautama received supreme enlightenment. So I like to differentiate between what we consider the historical Gautama, who in stories that have circulated is identified as male. But Buddhahood is beyond maleness. There have been, in certain Buddhist traditions, female Buddhas. We know this. So Buddha as a concept is not dominated by gender identity. And the same would go for the character that we look at so much at the December Christmas time, this idea of Jesus, the stories, which are great stories that we have from the New Testament. In fact, there's only actually two of them, but people push them together. That Jesus was a male figure, he, him pronouns. But the idea of Christ is genderless. So when one is given a title, Reverend, my title is genderless. You can be in many Christian circles, male, female, transgender woman, transgender man. Um, but yeah, Christ is a title, Buddha is a title. These are genderless titles. So yeah, I love talking about pronouns. So you call me out though if I make a mistake on my pronouns or saying something, because we all need help and support when it comes to correct language. So that's what I appreciate about you and CSDI.
Of course, yeah, and it's interesting to me because it's a big topic, right? Like I'm not sure about the position titles within religious communities, but I remember, for example, I'm not sure if it's reverend, but like a certain spiritual leader in churches, it's historically only for men, and it's only recently that has opened up for women. I'm not sure if it's reverend or being a pastor. I don't remember like what the title is. But so why do you think, basically my question is, why do you think why do you think people, or yeah, why or when do you think people started assigning these roles to these roles if they are truly gender inclusive?
Well, to go back a little bit, I said the title reverend is gender inclusive because it's an adjective. So I am suggested to be revered. So that is a title, the reverend. I think you're referring historically to the Roman Catholic Church, who has only given that title to men, and they're often called father so and so. They are designated as priests. In my particular Christian tradition, the United Methodist Church, we have been ordaining women for 60 years. So since the late 1950s, and some of your listeners and you have probably heard about the ongoing controversy right now that our denomination, the United Methodist Church, is splitting because some people don't want to extend that to the LGBTQ plus IA community. So that is breaking up our church in order to be able to, well, I don't know, I can't finish that sentence. It's breaking up our church.
That's sad to hear. If you're comfortable sharing, otherwise we can move on. Like mm, what do you find is the reason for that resistance?
Well, prejudice, fear, um, white supremacy in some cases, the lack of ability to be able to share power.
But isn't the purpose of um the bigger picture purpose of religion to do good for the people and do good to society and be good as a person?
Well said. Politics always comes into play, though.
Will you talk more about that?
Well, I think we're getting a little bit away from the December question, but that's fine. I think when power is consolidated amongst the few who control a particular religion, that power does not necessarily want to be shared. So I think about my own experience being ordained as a woman. I'm not that old, as 60 years ago, but that's when power needed to begin to be shared with women. So now there's even less power to be shared with the LGBTQ community. So I think while you began this conversation about acknowledging Indigenous peoples and land acknowledgements, it's hard for some organized religions to acknowledge that all people should have the same access to disseminate knowledge.
Well said, well said.
I
And
mean,
well, on that topic,
mhm.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. And on the topic of power, right? Let's jump kind of like right back and onto a new aspect of today's topic, which is Christocentricity.
Mm-hmm.
So, would you want to please educate the audience and myself on the concept of Christocentricity and what that is about?
So you brought this up at the very beginning of the conversation. As someone from Singapore, you find that Christmas is celebrated widely where people, correct me if I misheard you, are not necessarily practicing Christians, right? So there's this idea of that, to me, being the ultimate definition of what is Christocentric, putting the idea of Christ in places where it's not indigenous. So if I'm sitting here in the Interfaith Center exclusively in front of a cross, I'm going to move my head, there's my cross. If there was just a cross in here, you could say this room was Christocentric. But what we have in here is a tree of life. We have a Star of David, and I'm going to see if you can see over there the Om and the lotus flower. Yeah, we need 3D. We need 3D for this. So this room, I hope, is the opposite of being Christocentric, but it's the idea of putting Christ in the middle of all conversations, whether that idea belongs there or not. So, think about the word Christmas itself. Why is that used in so many cultures? Why not Yule? December 21st, the idea of the returning sun in the northern hemisphere, celebration of the return of light, and a Norse pagan celebration of the winter-born sun. The sun's coming back. That to me is more global than Christmas. That's just me talking. Have you ever heard
Yeah.
Christmas called Yule? Sometimes
I've heard
it is.
Yule logs.
Yeah. So Yule
But I
log.
didn't know that. Yeah. I didn't
So
know Yule
that's
is a day.
holiday. That's the tradition of people would and still do today, if you're Wiccan or neo-pagan, would and I use those terms broadly, would bring a log in the house and light it to signify that light is returning to the northern hemisphere. It's a very northern hemisphere holiday. Because right now, the shortest day of the year is going to be December 21st, right? And then here in the Northern Hemisphere, we wake up on the 22nd and the day's a little bit longer and the day's a little bit longer. So light is coming back to us. That's why people decorate evergreen trees. Evergreen trees are not Christian. In fact, I can't give you a specific example, but historically in certain parts of Europe, trees were banned as pagan idols and not allowed in Christian churches. I could look that up for you later. But the idea now that, Christians will bring a tree in the house and put lights on it and decorate it, that's all part of Yuletide traditions.
Huh.
I like a good light. I like light. I'm very fond of light. That's why we're having the Festival of Lights next week. I hope you can join us. It's going to be a webinar.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we should definitely talk about that near to the end of the session so everyone can join, everyone listening into this. But yeah, I was just thinking about Yule and Christmas, and I think it's interesting how things get mushed into one, and one of the festival kind of dominate over another, if that makes sense. Like it takes whatever it likes, and then kind of not give credit. And if that's not Christocentricity, I don't know what is. And talking about that the concept that Christ is in the middle of everything and every conversation, whether or not it belongs there, it kind of reminds me of Christian missions, like going overseas and having those missions. I don't know about the States, like what the definition of that is, but in Singapore, I remember when I have Christian friends, their goal during summer break or when they have a holiday is to go overseas to quote unquote less fortunate countries and quote unquote help the disadvantaged. And as I grow up, and especially when I come to the States, I kind of get to know more about Christian missions and kind of have a different perception on what exactly people are doing there. And so for you, I guess my question is, do you think there's a link between Christocentricity, what we talked about colonialism and Christian missions, or do you think like they're just separate things? And yeah.
Oh, I think it's very much connected. But let me put it this way, because there really is two kinds. Well, there are at least two kinds of what I would call Christian missions. And let me ask it this way. You and I are at Suffolk University, and your office, CSDI, Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion, and the Interfaith Center on the same floor. And we have another office on this floor called the Center for Community Engagement, right? And they go
Right.
out on spring break to build houses. They go out on spring break to LGBTQIA communities, right? So you would never be, well, one would not be suspicious that they had a hidden agenda. They would just be helping college students help meet the needs of those that are not as privileged as we are. Would you agree?
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So those, there can be Christian missions that have that same ideology. I accept that I have privilege, and I accept that I need to share what wealth and means that I have and what abilities I have to make the world a better place. Okay. No harm, no foul on that. But there's some Christian missions who would take it a different direction and say, well, as long as I'm here helping you, have you read the Bible? Have you heard about Jesus? Would you like to be, in some cases, the term born again is used. So while I'm helping you with your physical needs, let me help you with your spiritual needs. And for a lot of progressive Christians like myself, this is where that line is crossed. Because shouldn't I be wishing to help you because you're you, but not necessarily try to make you accommodate to my Christocentric worldview?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that what you were seeing with some of your experiences in Singapore, that people were going out with this convert you idea?
Yeah, they go out and they are like, my church leaders tell me that I need to spread the word of God.
Mhm.
And they do that not just on Christian missions, but they do that with us as classmates and as friends.
Mm.
So we have like Muslim friends, we have Buddhist friends, we have friends who do not have any
Mhm.
religious affiliation, and um regardless of all of that, Christian friends in that circle would often try to get us to go to church on Sundays and things like that. And again, that's my personal experience.
Mhm.
I know that some of my friends have similar experience in school, but of course, not all Christians in Singapore are like that. Not everyone behaves that way. At the same time, so one of the times when I was younger, I remember I went to church with one of my friends. Just wanting to be a good friend. And frankly, it was scary. It was scary to be in an environment where I don't know what's happening and people start singing, and some people I know now seems to be speaking in tongues, and
Mhm.
um and they pass around this basket,
Mhm.
and I see people putting money in it. And I
Mhm.
was like, as a student, I was like, I have no money and I'm not a follower of this church, but I can feel that pressure to put something in there.
Mhm.
And so it kind of makes me think about religion in a different light, but at the same time I've also learned to kind of separate the person practicing what they perceive to be that religion and that religion itself.
I
How
think
about
that's very important. I think that's very important. And I think when we move out of our comfort zone and learn about other religions, for example, if we are an atheist or an agnostic or a Buddhist or a Christian, and we learn about others, then it's harder to define them as the other. too many others in that sentence. But if we know something about some forms of Buddhism and we know something about some forms of paganism, then we can see that they're not strangers anymore. But I've had people tell me, "Oh, I don't want to take your world religions class because it might make me change my religion." What if it makes you smarter about other people and makes you smarter about yourself and makes you think a little bit about, to go back to the beginning, where Christmas comes from, and where the idea of the Jesus birth narratives, there's only two, and there's two different narratives that are in the New Testament. But we tend to, I think, with all the commercialization of Christmas, we as Christians, myself, we lose sight of the Advent, which is a major holy day that started on November 29th this year, and it celebrates the coming of Jesus the first time and anticipates the coming of Jesus the second time, and it lasts 4 weeks, and we light candles, and you don't see that as much as you do Christmas trees.
For sure. And in fact, Christmas trees has become almost like an icon for December and for snow. Nothing to
Mhm.
do with religion anymore,
I agree.
you
I
know?
agree. The commercialization of the holiday, but again, and you know more about this than I do, but that whole marketing to sell products, that whole way of promoting to get people to spend and to buy. And you had a question or a thought about Black Friday, which I think wasn't it Roosevelt that declared that President Roosevelt, that Thanksgiving would be the fourth Thursday, and then the day after would become a day off so people could start their shopping. Something like that
Really?
historically. Something like that historically, because it's a Friday in between a Thursday and a Saturday holiday for those people that are privileged to have a weekend. Not everybody, has time off on the weekend. But yeah, Black Friday this year. Then you got your Cyber Monday, which is yesterday. So I don't know. A lot of pressure to buy things, which I'm trying to avoid.
Yeah, for sure, consumerism, At the same time, right, this year has been a year like no other. So you should treat yourself, accordingly and appropriately. And that also reminds me though, you talk about neo-pagan, and previously I did an episode on Halloween, and I
Mhm.
was researching on paganism and things like that. And would you share with the audience what pagan actually means and why the relation of like Wiccan and to witches and witches equals bad?
Oh, that's so complicated. So there's so many terms floating around. You have Wiccans, you have neo-Wiccans, you have witches, you have pagans, you have neo-pagans. So, you know, everybody who participates in those religious identities have a different way of describing it. So I just want to honor that everybody describes themselves very differently. But the term pagan originated, as we best know, in the first century in the Roman period in the country the area designated Palestine, as a pagan was someone who was not from the city. So if you were not from Rome, you were a pagan. And this went to those who existed in Palestine. So Jews at that time in the first century would be pagans. So anyone who was not part of the city. Then the church, the Roman Catholic Church, begins to take this term over, and it becomes synonymous with someone who is not Christian. So it becomes a term of disparagement, but I would suggest, and again, I'm not pagan, but I would suggest that pagans are reclaiming this term today. So to be proud to call yourself a pagan, or to be proud to call yourself a neo-pagan. Then there's the whole debate, are Wiccans a different religion, or are they a branch of paganism? Are witches all Wiccans, and are Wiccans all witches? So there's so many different, and I'll use the term denomination, although that's peculiar to Christianity, but there's so many ways and denominations of how to be Wiccan. Yesterday in my class, we were talking about Gardnerian Wicca, which was a religious movement from the 1960s, a particular way to define yourself as a witch. That was a way too long answer.
No, that's perfectly fine. I think it's good to give like an overview to people who have probably never heard. Like I think a lot of us have heard of witches,
Mhm.
but we haven't really heard of Wiccans or pagans. And those who have heard of those terms probably have a negative association with it. They probably didn't realize that pagan just means a country dweller. Like
Well, I think it goes back to your opening comment about respect for indigenous people and land. In some aspects, we look back to indigenous practices and call them pagan because we don't like them. It's a way to disparage somebody. Or you've heard the terrible term used, savages. Ways to say I'm civilized and you're not civilized. So there's a lot of disparagement by the Christian community of paganism, associating it with Satanism, for example. And believe me, Satanism, paganism, two very different things. And there are many versions of Satanism. We could do a podcast just on Satanism one semester. That would be good.
Yeah, we can definitely do that next semester. I actually
Hmm.
would be very interested. Um, for all of you listening, if you are interested to, do write in either to Reverend Amy Fisher or to CSDI, and we'll be happy to do the episode. Or in fact, we'll just do that episode.
Hmm.
So I think it's interesting in that way that a lot of how history has unfolded for the religious community seems to revolve around in that way the same players like Roman um Catholics and Christianity, and hence again like Christocentricity, where a lot of things kind of like revolve around Christ.
Hmm.
And would you say that that's the reason why um in that way it's difficult for pagans and Wiccans to identify themselves as such, because you mentioned that it is an identity that they're trying to reclaim, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I wonder if that the current society is so Christocentric that makes it difficult for them to be able to say in public that they are Wiccans and they are pagans
I
because of
agree.
these negative connotations.
I agree. And similar situation, we have a group here at Suffolk University, as you know, called the Atheists, Agnostics, Humanists, and Anti-Theists. And in the same way, it's not exactly, some people don't want to say, hey, I'm an atheist because of, I
Right.
think, it's so much Christian cultural identity, if I can put it that way, that goes on. I mean, atheists are somewhat looked down on. I mean, possibly in Boston area, we are a little more accommodating of different views, but I'm not sure. I don't want to claim that we are, but I think in certain parts of the world, if you said you were an atheist, you might be considered to be very circumspect, and to your point, and a pagan. Yeah.
Like lawless kind of moment.
Hmm. So we have some good
Yeah.
conversations in that group. It's a very exciting group, and it's sustained itself during this pandemic times, which I want to acknowledge that so many people are going through so much during this pandemic, with their classes, with being online all the time, and those people are the ones that can be. So I want to acknowledge that there are people who don't have internet resources. There are people who can't attend their classes.
Yeah. And alongside the acknowledgement, I really thank you for for holding those sessions in the Interfaith Center for communities like that, who are frankly mostly neglected and disregarded in the current society, to have a space, to share and have a
Hmm.
space to find people like them, in the Suffolk community who have who shares a spiritual belief. I think it's so beautiful when people of all religion and all beliefs come to the Interfaith Center, and we just share and we just talk about, like you mentioned, inform ourselves and talk about our beliefs. And for me, it's kind of like a life of pi moment. I'm not sure if you've read that
Yeah,
story,
yeah, yeah, I
like the
did.
boy
Mhm.
the boy going to mosques, going to churches, praying to different gods. I don't like, it's a personal opinion that I see that to be education. Experiencing is education. But I digress. So let's segue into talking about religion and politics, specifically American politics. So I've heard of the term where they mention that, it's like a separation between the church and the state and things like that. And at the same time, I find it strange. Like, there's always this tingly feeling. I don't even know how to describe it, but when especially with the current elections, right? When president-elect or anybody would end their speech with "and God bless America." And that makes me wonder, kind of like, with all the, not just the end of the speech, with ending speeches with "God bless America," but also with the current fight over religious freedom, with the current fight over abortion based on religious beliefs, and also vaccinations based on religious beliefs. What are your thoughts about the relationship between those two?
Well, I don't know if you ever took that class here at Suffolk called Diversity in the Workplace, or maybe you've heard of it over in our Sawyer Business School. But I get invited in when they talk about religion in the workplace, because it directly relates to what you're saying about religious freedom. But let me go back historically to the 90s with President Bill Clinton. There was a federal law that was passed, and we could do another podcast on that. Federal law that was passed about freedom of religion in the workplace. So, meaning, I go to my workplace, I can wear my hijab. I go to my workplace, I can wear a Star of David. So this was really on the federal level, and to my understanding, it never got adopted state by state. But employers would look to that to try to accommodate freedom of religion. So here's a place to pray 5 times a day towards Mecca if you're Muslim. Here's a place to provide with zazen meditation. So ways of accommodating. And then what happened in the 2000s is that instead of it becoming a way to help all religions, it became, this is my understanding, a way for some people to say, wait, I have the religious freedom not to do that. I have the religious freedom not to, and you'll get this famous example, bake a wedding cake for the LGBT community members. Remember that case out in Colorado, the cake baker? And it was, I have the religious freedom because I am a Christian who does not believe in LGBTQ rights, and therefore I do not have to bake them a cake. Anyway, I don't want to get too far off the subject, but this whole idea that it became a cry from what I call the conservative religious Christian right to say we have a right not to accommodate everybody else. And so then you get into these discussions about the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. In the 60s, there was this cry to take under God out of that. And many kids in schools in the United States were forced to say that, and they said, well, I'm an atheist. I shouldn't have to say that. So what I'm trying to say is this freedom of religion has been flipped, and now it's going for the cause of the what I call the conservative religious Christian right. And that's where, the evangelical theology, which goes across many different Christian denominations, becomes apparent. And it's very complicated, very complicated.
Yeah, and on the topic of evangelicals, right? Before I talk about politics, I didn't really hear that denomination being talked about. And so would you educate us and give us kind of like an overview on what basically kind of distincts evangelism?
Evangelicals, well, it comes from the root, it's a Greek word, which means to share the good news. So take that back to your Singapore associates and friends. They were being evangelicals when they went out to other countries and shared the good news of the Christian message. So evangelicalism is not a specific Christian denomination, but it is a way of thinking, a theology that pervades many different Christian denominations. So one could be an evangelical Baptist, one could be an evangelical Methodist, one could be an evangelical Catholic, Roman Catholic even. So it's this idea of sharing the good news. Many Christians who consider themselves to be non-denominational, meaning they're not Methodist, they're not Baptist, they're not Presbyterian, they're not Roman Catholic, they consider themselves sometimes to be evangelical. So here's a really good example. I'm United Methodist. George W. Bush, former president, was also Methodist. Hillary Rodham Clinton, also United Methodist. Now, politically, Hillary Rodham Clinton and George W. Bush are very distinguishable, but they share the same Christian Protestant denomination. George W. Bush was considered an evangelical. That was his way of defining his Christianity. But Hillary, her way of defining it was progressive liberal theology response to help the other. But I'm not a political scientist, so don't that's my opinion.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is because I think evangelical, or they call themselves evangelicals, kind of have a negative connotation, or at least to me. Because like you mentioned, they tend to be people who use laws like religious freedom for their own, frankly, selfish benefit. And I say selfish not because of necessarily of their religion, but selfish because they use it when it suits them. Like for example, talking about pro-life, right? Oh, I'm pro-life and hence I'm anti-abortion. But if you're pro-life, then what about immigrant children who are losing their lives in detention centers? About people who are facing death penalties, who obviously were frankly victims of systemic racism more than a crime. So where's your pro-life when it comes to life, instead of just anti-abortion? And that's just one example, right, of what at least I think when people say the word evangelicals, where they kind of they like, it makes me wonder if they're spreading the word of God and spreading what they believe to be true, or they're spreading what they perceive to be their religion, if that makes sense.
That's a very interesting way to look at it. And we certainly are in the middle of, well, I was going to say in the middle of an election cycle, but our election is over. We're in the middle of a cycle for inaugurating a new president. And I think, for only the second time in history in the United States, we'll have a Roman Catholic president.
Yeah, and he is, for the lack of a better word, he is unashamed of it, and he shouldn't be, but it's more of like, I don't use the word out, but he's very, he takes that with pride, and he takes that as part of the reason why he's the person who he is now. And that's okay, but it makes me wonder again, if a person is, say, Buddhist, or even a pagan, would people receive or even shrug that fact off the same way they did with the current president-elect?
That's interesting. So how would it be if we had an atheist candidate or an atheist
Right.
for president? Yeah, I think we will see that maybe in my lifetime, maybe in your lifetime. I think as we strive to more diversity in our system, we need that. We need that sort of diversity of thought.
We do. And it definitely makes me wonder, with what you mentioned about the history of religion being in politics and one nation under God. I wonder when the day comes, if it'll be met with resistance, because people, would be worried about their religion being, the 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 religi taken, quote unquote, taken away, or again, under attack. And
Mhm.
I guess it's something that we'll see. And mhm,
Goes back to what I was saying about let's educate ourselves about other worldviews, other non-Christocentric views, so that we can have a conversation. The Interfaith Center here at Suffolk is all about dialogue, and it's not about let me get you to agree with me. Let me just talk to you like we're doing now. We don't have to agree to have a conversation, but I think so many times people are afraid to have conversations where they know they're not going to agree, but that's where the learning occurs. So I think our
yeah,
country could do this, United States could do with some of that dialogue and open conversation. You mentioned all the events that we have in the Interfaith Center, and they are particular to a religious group, but everyone is invited. And what other time in one's life is it really easy in college, pre-pandemic, but to go to these other religious groups and just say, I don't understand why you do this. And then somebody just sit down and explain it to you. And of course, now during this pandemic, we are trying to meet over Zoom. And do you know what I think about Zoom? You didn't ask me this, but I want to interject. I think in some ways that Zoom has made conversations more accessible to people
I agree.
and less accessible, because if people don't have internet access, then they become um, disenfranchised. But those who do, who might not have had the opportunity to physically go somewhere, can now go over Zoom. So I'm seeing that. I'm seeing a rise in participation, but I'm also seeing a decrease in participation, just for those two polar opposites that I was talking about. So I don't know how this is all going to work out. After the pandemic, if I can say that, then we will have to go to a model that's both and Zoom and physical. I'm looking forward to figuring out the models for doing religious pluralism and dialogue in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And for those who are interested, in joining um, Reverend Amy Fisher's session for different religious communities. As she mentioned, it's open to all. And if you have difficulty with internet access, you can actually call into Zoom
Mhm,
using phone. You
mhm,
don't need internet
mhm,
data. You just don't get to see the faces, their lovely faces, but you're able to join into that conversation. You're able to speak and converse. And I think you're right. I think the nation really needs restoration right now through conversation and through education. I think a lot of times when someone goes to another person and be like, I don't understand why you're doing this, a lot of times they're going with anger and
mhm,
they're going and they're saying it with the reference or inference that you are wrong rather
mhm,
than I
mhm,
want to understand and I don't understand.
mhm,
And I hope our audience right here and people out there really starts to adopt this mentality of when you say you don't understand, make sure that you want to understand before you go to another person and make them educate you because it's their precious time and sometimes they actually have to take effort into educating you because they have to relieve experiences, they have to relieve certain things and it can be tough. And so before you go to someone and be like, I want to have a conversation with you, make sure you have the mental capacity and that you're honest with yourself that you really want to learn
mhm,
and have that conversation. And this is actually what's going on podcast series is about. It's about helping you start conversations like that and get the guest speakers that are on these episodes tend to be people who have currently hold events, often free events, um, for the topic at hand. And so kind of to wrap up this session, I just have a last question. um you mentioned the word denominations is kind of peculiar to the Christian community. So when we talk about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, we talk about language too. So would you want
mhm.
to educate us on how that's peculiar and a little bit Christocentric?
Oh, yes, good question. Because when we think about Christianity, for example, sometimes we we can assume that there's one unity, that all Christians kind of have the same ideas, and they don't. So if we say Christianity came about in the 1st century of the Common Era, the very first split, the very first denomination came about in the 400s of the Common Era, and then in 1000. Circa 1000, the great split between the Orthodox Christians and the Roman Catholic tradition. So these all become denominations. And then particularly when we have the Protestant break from the Catholics in 1517, then we begin to get all of these different protesters or Protestants who begin to then diverge and diverge and diverge. So we have denominations like Methodists, Baptists, Mennonites, Quakers, Universalists. So the list goes on and on and on. So when we say denominations, technically we're referring to different forms of Christianity, not forms of different religion. That would be interfaith or pluralism. So when we admit that there's more than one religion in the world, we are identifying that it's a religiously pluralistic world. But denominations tend to be Christocentric term. But I did use the term to talk, to borrow the term and talk about different denominations of pagans, Wiccans, neo-pagans, Druids, but that would not be a term that was historically applied to those groups. I think that's a modern phenomenon. So yeah, and there's different denominations, quote unquote, of Church of Satan. So it gets all complicated. But yeah, I think particularly it's a Christocentric term. But don't we use a lot of Christocentric terms and then we dig down and we see that they're Christocentric? We're like, oh, did I use that for this? And it's really a term from Christianity. So Christocentric, I like to equate it sometimes with egocentric, right? If we're egocentric, we're thinking about ourselves. If we're Christocentric, we sometimes don't even realize that we're looking at things through a Christian lens.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it'll be a fun kind of supplemental exercise for us to kind of Google, what are the common colloquial terms we use that are actually Christocentric or have a
Well, that
Christian
would be
origin.
fun.
I think, yeah, I think that would be really fun, and I probably will put some fun ones on the again description for this episode. So yeah, once again, thank you so much, Reverend Fisher, for taking the time. Do you have any last words, and also talk to us about Festival of Lights next week?
Well, thank you. One of the main events from the Interfaith Center at Suffolk University is our end of the year, what we call the Festival of Lights. Many religious traditions, not all by any means, many religious traditions have a lighting ritual that occurs during the time of Yule, like we talked about in the Northern Hemisphere. So on December 10th, next Thursday at 1 o'clock, the Interfaith Center is providing a webinar. You can go to the suffolk.edu/interfaith website, but we will be over Zoom and this webinar lighting the candles for Advent, Kwanzaa, Yule, Hanukkah, and many others. Again, not all religions have a lighting component, but what this really is the culmination of a semester worth of religious dialogue in the Interfaith Center. And I'm kind of excited this year because it's going to be a webinar so we can post it. Maybe CSDI would like to post a copy of it, and certainly the Interfaith Center website will post a copy of it, or we'll just see how it turns out. I think it'll be a little shorter this year, but that's okay. That's okay. Our atheists, agnostics, and atheists, humanists, agnostics, and anti-theists also participate and look forward to a winter break. But we're all acknowledging this year that the pandemic has put us in a very different place, and winter break is not going to be the break that we're all used to in higher education. I think we have a lot to go through before we get to the other side of this pandemic experience. So I don't want to make light of that whole experience that people are going through. It's very serious.
Yeah, and I think regardless of religious affiliation, I think many of us have been feeling lonely during this time. And
Mhm.
throughout the episode, we talk about coming together, right? And also understanding everyone and also understanding different religion with an open mind. And I think the Festival of Lights event on December 10th is the perfect place to start for many of our listeners. And so definitely I will post that again in the description box. If you are looking for the event or the sign up link or the Zoom ID, it will all be under the website. Just click that link on the description box below and you'll be directed there. So once again, this is what's going on, and I thank you for listening. Thank you, Reverend Amy Fisher, for coming and speaking to us about religion in different aspects. And again, I hope everyone stay safe, have a good time, take care, and I'll see you next semester.
Thank you.